So no relationships to disclose. Keep going. So this is, some of you may have seen this talk before. This is a modification of a talk I've been doing for quite a few years at IMMH. This is, however, more focused on food-based mycotoxins. So I've always talked about that because it is important to have that in your mindset when you're reviewing mycotoxin tests. So when I started doing this early on, I automatically thought that mold mycotoxins showing up in a patient's test were automatically water damage building. And then you can go on a wild goose chase. And guess what? There wasn't any. Well, because it's in food. So again, I've been one of the few docs talking about this for years. This is the talk I've been wanting to do for a while. It's really focusing in on mold in food. Now, just to start off, mold in food is not as bad as living in a water damaged building. It may contribute to the problem, but not going to be as bad as living in, Aspergillus, Stachybotrys all over your house. But again, it may affect the tests because I have so many patients coming to me with a mycotoxin test that says, I have mold. And I said, well, let's take a look. And it might not be from the building. Next slide. So I work at the Amen Clinic. And one of the cool tools I have to use is a SPECT scan. So this really helps me a lot in figuring out, as a previous speaker mentioned, a lot of folks that we see have mental health illnesses, mental health issues that may be psychological or may be biological. So I tell every patient that my job is to try to figure out which one it is. Sometimes it's both. One tool I have to help is the SPECT scan. So this literally can show the brain activity, and you can tell probably without much difficulty which brain you'd rather have here. So we can see toxicity on this scan. That does help me to try to separate the biological, psychological split in patients. Next slide. So again, many things can cause the scan to look bad. Environmental toxins, as was just discussed, lots of things, head injuries. We're going to focus on the mycotoxin component of this problem. Next. So this is one of the agents I call brain snatchers. So this could be mold, this could be Lyme, this could be other toxoplasma, things that literally can steal your mind and have you may have no idea. So pesticides, as was just mentioned, all those toxicities can affect your physical and mental health. Next. So mycotoxins are the metabolite produced by fungi. Now, not all mold produces mycotoxins, but several of them do, which we're going to look into much more detail here. And mycotoxicosis is the disease caused by exposure to mycotoxins. Next. So these are not fun things for us. They're quite damaging to almost every organ we have, including the brain, liver, kidney, endocrine, immune system, especially the immune system. Again, this is general mold exposure now, so we'll dive into the food part in a bit here. You get from food and from water damaged buildings. So in the water damaged building aspect and food as well, the severity of the problem is determined by several factors. So the exposure and duration, the dose, your basic toxin level, how much is in your bucket already, your genetics, your detoxability. So, all that stuff that we already look at in our patients can be affect the patient's ability to handle mycotoxins, like all other toxins. Next. So again, the two primary exposures are water damaged buildings and food. Water damaged buildings, again, likely much more of a severe problem. Next. And there's two major physiologic aspects of mold and mycotoxin exposure. So there's the allergic inflammatory response, just like pollen could do in a home, outside or in a home with seasonal allergies, dust mites. You can have allergic type reactions from mold spores, but then you have the toxic component. Again, not all mold is toxin forming. Many of them are. So those are the ones that we're more concerned with for overall health, especially nervous system and immune health. Next. So as I mentioned, not all molds produce toxins. Many do. Fusarium, which can be, again, food and buildings. Penicillium, Aspergillus, Chaetomium, it's actually spelled wrong. Claviceps, Stachybotrys, that's the black mold people talk about, although several species are actually black. Wallemia, so the Stachybotrys and Wallemia are almost assuredly from a house rather than food. Next. So again, common reactions you can think of allergic type response to even non-toxic mold. Next. Now we have the CNS issues. So this is where the mycotoxins come into play. Probably the most common symptom of mold exposure, mycotoxin exposure, is brain fog. Very common. I can't think, I can't sleep, I can't focus, my memory's not good. That's common. There are a lot of other sort of unusual symptoms you can have, like electrical type symptoms that can't be explained by nerve conduction or dermatomes even, and other things, especially in a water damaged building. But definite mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, irritability, sleep problems. Next. So again, the mental health issue, this is where I work, the Amen Clinic. If you don't know, I work with about 70 psychiatrists. We have about 5 or 6 functional docs now that deal with the biological component of their mental health issues, and it's really big. So many of our patients have a physical component to their mental health condition, whatever that is. And if you don't look, you're not going to find it. So that's why we do all this investigation. And as the previous speaker said, taking the history is critical. You know, whatever happened to you in the past, what were you doing? Where were you? I ask every patient, do you spray your home for toxic chemicals? Where did you work? You'll be amazed at some of these stories that come out. Oh yeah, I used to work in this building and there was mold dripping off the ceiling. I mean, it was, you know, if you don't ask, you're just not going to know that history. Next slide. So even if mycotoxins aren't the main cause of the problem, they can make everything worse. In fact, you know, I'm also a Lyme doc, ILADS doc, and you may see, you know, chronic Lyme patients who just never get better. And if indeed it's Lyme, which sometimes it's not, it could be because they are exposed to mold. So if you have current mold exposure, you're not likely ever going to get over Lyme or other chronic infections. Very immunosuppressive. So it can make everything that they have worse, much like COVID and vaccines have reactivated some of our chronic patients who were stable because of the immune disruption. Mycotoxins can do the same thing. Metals as well. So if you have a lot of mercury, you know, I tell my patients for you to get better, you have to clear the runway for takeoff. And what can block that? Well, many things. Mold is one of them. Metals are another, etc. So again, it can worsen whatever underlying problems are there. Next. So there are several common mold toxins. Ochratoxin is almost universal, which we'll talk about soon. Aflatoxin, one of the most carcinogenic substances known. Trichothecenes are the quote bad ones. These are the black mold type molds, quite damaging. They hinder protein synthesis. There's also volatile organics. Again, this is in the building. Next slide. So when ingested, now this is getting towards our main topic of foodborne mycotoxins. The food is the moldy food is ingested and it is excreted, but then there's reuptake. So the hepatorecirculation, enterohepatic recirculation, That's why we use binders, even for cholesterol, even though they don't work that well, like cholestyramine, to grab them in the lumen before they get reabsorbed. And that's why binders work. Binders don't become systemic, right? So if you take charcoal and clays, et cetera, they're not going to go in your bloodstream and pull things out. They pull it out from the gut. So if you indeed have systemic issues, binders are not going to get rid of that. You need, systemic treatment, antifungals, et cetera. Next slide. So why do we care about all this? Well, we'll see. Next slide, please. So if you have any of these organs here on the right, you should probably care. So aflatoxin, deoxynivalenol, which is the most common one in food. These all affect multiple systems in your body, basically all of them. So that's a reason to not have too many of these around. Next slide. Why are they bad? How are they doing this? Well, there's multiple ways they're doing this. These mycotoxins, again, this is any type of mycotoxin, either water damage building or food. So T2 is one of the most common and worrisome food-based mycotoxins in the animal world. And I'll be showing quite a few slides on animal husbandry. This industry, as far as raising pigs, cows, chickens, et cetera, is well aware of mycotoxin problems in mammals, animals, because it affects their production, their health, their weight, their making babies. So if you have a lot of mycotoxins in animal feed, they don't do well. And they know which toxins do what to a great extent. So how do they cause this damage? Well, they can cause direct neuronal cell apoptosis. So they kill cells directly. They can cause degeneration in the cerebral cortex and disruption of ceramide synthesis. So this is part of the fatty acid turnover in our body and our cell membranes. They can also, ochratoxin, which again is almost universally present, acute depletion of dopamine and its metabolites. So it's damaging, and these are damaging in multiple ways. Next slide. Again, this is just another slide showing T2 toxin in particular, how it does its damage on the brain and other areas. Next slide. One of the common, now you don't hear about mold in food much, at least not in the US. Other countries, there have been significant problems. So this is back in the Middle Ages when there was St. Anthony's fire, which is ergot poisoning. And this is mold on rye, wheat, rye grains that were stored. They get moldy, and you make bread or what have you out of it. And one of the interesting symptoms is mania and psychosis. So significant mental status changes. And this is thought to possibly be a cause for bewitchment back then. And you didn't have psychiatrists around to say, this is from mold. No, they usually, drown them or did other great things, burn them at the stake, etc. There's the famous story of, if you were a witch, they tied a rock and threw you in the lake, and if you sunk, you were innocent. If you floated, they killed you anyway because you're a witch. It's not a good ending. So this killed thousands of people in the Middle Ages. Next slide. That is the actual mold on the Next slide. This, I'm sure most of you folks know Dale Bredesen. This is his paper several years back showing that he actually called it inhalational Alzheimer's disease. So mold can either mimic or cause dementia-like symptoms. And that's based on mostly the Shoemaker protocol, which we may talk about. Again, this talk is geared mostly towards the food side. I do have the full talk on this, talks about water damage buildings, treatment modalities. Other speakers will be talking about treatment today. Next slide. This was kind of a scary one, that they had patients that on autopsy, Alzheimer's patients, where they actually found fungal DNA in their brain and did not find it in controls. and it was multiple species. Now that includes things like Candida, which is a fungi. And we know that can cross the blood-brain barrier. Candida is very common, as most of us know. But again, this could be other fungi as well, including mold. Next slide. So deoxynivalenol, DON, is, again, one of the most common molds found in grains, including here in the US, which we'll see shortly. So this mycotoxin decreases the viability of glial cells. Now, glial cells are the helper cells in the brain, among other things, but they help keep the neurons running, so to speak, and it damages those. Therefore, you can have neuronal or brain injury from that. Also works with lipopolysaccharide in a synergistic way, which is not good. So LPS is very inflammatory, and this seems to accelerate LPS damage. So this study, again, the results suggest that environmental ribotoxins like deoxynivalenol at low doses, again, which is what most of us are getting it at from food, can cause modifications in brain homeostasis, possibly participate in the etiology of neuronal diseases where glia are involved. So several of conditions are like that, including Parkinson's. Next slide. So I'll be showing studies demonstrating how these things cause trouble, what mechanisms, and where they affect the body. It turns out all over. So patulin is almost exclusively in apples. And it's quite common in apples and apple juice. So this shows, again, patulin alters the barrier function of the gut. So this may directly cause leaky gut syndrome. And ochratoxin A, again, which is almost universally present, also interrupts intestinal barrier function. So we have a direct cause of leaky gut from orally ingested mycotoxins. Next slide. Deoxynivalenol, DON, alters neuroendocrine signaling too. So again, we have the direct damage, the toxin damage, the support cell damage, and they can also directly alter signaling of neurotransmitters, including in the gut. So growth hormone axis, altered gut integrity. So again, signal transmission as well can be disrupted. Next slide. Blood-brain barrier disruption. Back to T2 toxin, again, which is in food largely. Again, one reason, just to backtrack a bit, I'm so excited about this new, this talk and what's coming soon from Great Plains is we are finally going to check a lot more food-based mycotoxins. I think I can say that now. So that's going to really open this door to practitioners realizing that this stuff is in food too. Now, there's several prominent mold doctors out there who we sort of been going back and forth on, is it in food or not? I've said from day one, yes, it is. This will pretty much demonstrate that it is, because these are strictly from food. So that panel should be coming soon. Stay tuned. It's going to cover a lot more. I've been asking for this for years from Great Plains because of I just know how much of this is in food. So stay tuned. This should be pretty exciting. In any case, you can see even the food-based ones, is that working now? Can be a problem. So again, blood-brain barrier, permeability problems from T2 and MMP9. Now, some of you folks who are doing mold testing, if you're doing the Shoemaker protocol, if you've heard of that, you know that MMP9 is one of those blood markers. Again, here's why that may be pertinent. It can go up. It's an enzyme that can go up with inflammation. It's not specific for mold, however. None of those tests are. Next slide. So again, this is mycotoxins. Now, aflatoxin is not as common, thankfully, in food. It's one of the worst you could find on a mycotoxin test. Very carcinogenic. And again, this aflatoxin poisoning has killed many people. Results in symptoms like depression, anorexia, diarrhea, jaundice, and possibly death. In fact, there were a bunch of children in, I think it was Indonesia, several hundred, I believe, that died from aflatoxin poisoning from peanuts, which tend to have a high level of aflatoxin. Next slide. So this is, again, from the animal world, which we'll see several more slides soon, but the mycotoxins listed there on the left, the species it affects, next column over, you note humans are in almost all of those columns, and then the toxic effects in the center and on the far right, the immune response, all of which are not good. So reduced lymphoproliferation, decreased phagocytosis, cellular depletion in lymphoid organs. So on and on and on, every system almost in the immune system is hindered by mycotoxins. Next slide. Similar issue. Now, again, because so much of this information on food-based mycotoxins is from the animal business. Again, they had this down pat, which is why I look to them for guidance and information. Again, you can see they actually list productivity loss, by number of pluses there. All of them cause productivity loss in animals. Some are more immunotoxic than others. You can see zearalenone, which is on the GPL mycotox test, is not very immunosuppressive. However, on the far right, you'll see it has significant reproductive effects. So it acts like estrogen, very estrogenic. Next slide. So again, mold, your house doesn't have to look like this to have mold in it. I don't know what this guy's even doing. They should just burn it down. But in any case, next slide, we did a few more slides here on mold in your house. You're more likely to see this. It's behind the wall, it's in the ceiling, it's, it's not usually visible. It's not the stuff in the grout in your shower. That's mildew, not this kind of stuff. Next slide. Same thing here. Sometimes you find it when it presents itself, like falls through the ceiling. Next slide. Or under the floor. Next slide. So to the main topic, food. Yes, it is in food. Next slide. So there's not a lot of data on humans, mycotoxins in food, but there's enough to definitely have some data on it and its prevalence. So why is it there in the first place? It depends on how it's harvested. So climate conditions, storage practices, all that's it. This is not, lying around on your kitchen table getting moldy. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about mold prior to processing. So in the field, in the silo, it gets moldy somewhere, and then it's ground up and made into, bread and what have you. Next slide. So this is the Food and Agriculture Organization, sort of like the FDA. Approximately 25% of the world's agricultural products are contaminated with mycotoxins. It's probably even higher than that. So again, it could be before harvest, storage, anywhere along the chain. It can become moldy. Ill-preserved food, fungal growth can occur. Again, that's usually the stuff you see in your home or your fridge. That is not what we're talking about in general. Next slide. So there can be epidemic outbreaks. Again, usually not in the US. It's more in countries where they don't have very good storage options. So epidemic outbreaks can happen. Fairly commonly, again, in countries that don't have refrigeration, et cetera, or can't afford to throw away their moldy grain and eat it anyway. So the most important agricultural one is aflatoxin, very carcinogenic, really bad for your liver. Fumonisins linked with esophageal cancer and neural tube defects. There was a story several years back where I can't remember how many now, but it was quite a few women on the border of Texas and Mexico had children born with neural tube defects because of moldy corn that they were making tortillas with. And that was linked to contaminated corn. So clearly early in development, you don't want exposure to this. Deoxynivalenol is also called vomitoxin. So it causes GI upset as a big symptom in humans and other animals. So they can cause gastroenteritis. So in patients where you just can't figure out what's going on with their nausea, this may be a contributing factor. And also it turns out that I've seen this in a few patients that I thought was hyperemesis from cannabis, which can happen. But guess what? Cannabis gets grown and dried and gets moldy too. In fact, quite a lot. In fact, if you're using any CBD or hemp products, it's best to have them tested for mycotoxins. You can literally be smoking mycotoxins when you're using cannabis or ingesting it from other products. So this might be due to the mold exposure these folks are getting too. Again, ochratoxin is bad for your kidneys, although since this has been so ubiquitous for 1,000 years probably, we have a fairly good mechanism for getting rid of ochratoxin. Next slide. So, moldy food, this is not the bad stuff. This is kind of normal mold, even though it doesn't look very appetizing. Next slide. Same here, nuts are notorious for getting mold on them. Dates, again, things that are stored. So grains, nuts, dried fruit, things like that. Next slide. Again, this is not what we're worried about. This is stuff that's growing on your, I wouldn't eat it anyway, but still, this is not the dangerous type. Next. And salami, again, this is, I wouldn't want to particularly work in this environment, but not toxic. Next. This I don't think I would want either. Now, interesting, nowadays there's podcasts and spots online for every possible thing you could want to do. There's a salami makers website, and they go back and forth on, should we eat the green stuff? I'm not sure, is it good or not? I'd probably say no. Next slide. This is a mold that we're familiar with and eat often. So that's Roquefortii mold. Next slide. Another picture of it. Next slide. Again, this is stuff in your house, not a big issue. Next slide. I usually fly through these. Next slide. Still, I wouldn't want to be that guy working there. Kind of like a mold forest. But in any case, next slide. Now, this is one that more of you may have heard of. Dave Asprey kind of started his thing with moldy coffee and mold-free coffee. That's moldy coffee. You're not likely to see that level of mold, but there are several reports in the literature of coffee that gets molded. It turns out it's the drying method of drying the beans. And counter to what you would think, the wet processing is better than dry processing. So if you're a coffee snob, you may get custom coffee. It tells you how high it was grown and all that. It'll tell you the processing method. But I have sent off samples of coffee. Now, sent off my second one. I sent off a bag of Starbucks a couple of years back, 0 mycotoxins. I sent just a few weeks ago a bag of stuff that I use, 0 mycotoxins. So it's probably not super common in stuff we get here anyway. Next slide. So this is the World Mycotoxin Survey. And this shows they study grain harvests all over the world every year. And they list how many and what type of mycotoxins were found in which kinds of grain. So very helpful. Next slide. No, and by the way, the red isn't good, and US was in red there. So you can see here that there are the worst offenders were wheat and straw. In this case, it changes yearly, but usually it's wheat and corn, wheat and oats. Wheat's always one of them, always the top. And this is showing that, and this is the current survey from 2022. So 9.8 out of 10 samples had multiple mycotoxins in them, virtually universally present in grains. Next slide. So again, you can see here North America isn't great either. And if you look closely, I'm not sure how big you can see this, but you'll see little animals represented there and different mycotoxins. So again, this industry knows which animals are affected in what way by different mycotoxins. So again, much more information than we have in human folks, unfortunately, but I think we can extrapolate fairly well to us. Next slide. So as I mentioned, deoxynivalenol, which has not yet been able to be tested, hopefully soon, is the most common one you'll see in food. And remember that earlier slide about the presence of mold can exacerbate whatever you have going on. So if you're in a moldy house and you're eating moldy food, or food that's contaminated anyway, that is a synergism in a bad way, right? They can stack up and cause things to be worse. Next slide. So again, this is where does it get moldy? So, and which molds show up where? So in the field, again, it could rain before the harvest, things get moldy. Often I have tomatoes growing in my backyard. When it's wet, they get moldy. So the leaves anyway. So fumonisins, trichothecenes or trichothecenes, zearalenone, common in all these grains. So wheat, corn, barley, oats, crop silage that they feed animals. And then there's the storage problems. So aflatoxins show up there, ochratoxins as well. Again, stored things like soy, oats, wheat, corn. And then you got the ergoalkaloids. Those are more in grasses. So ryegrass, theoretically wheatgrass juice. Next slide. So the system in Europe, the European Union, there's quote no borders, theoretically, at least economically, but they do check food that comes from one country to another, and they'll reject it if it's problematic for several reasons. So they have a system to check food much more closely than we do here. Next slide. You can hit the slide. I think this should cycle through a few. It didn't. Can you go back one? So if you look, the bottom line here is that mycotoxin contamination was the second highest reason foods were rejected from crossing the border. 493, the highest was from pathogen contamination. So bacteria, other pathogens was the highest. The second highest reason for rejection, mycotoxins in the food. Next slide. So this changes from year to year as well, but you can see here where it says there were significant increases in notifications from year to year from 2014, 2015 for peanuts from China and hazelnuts from Turkey. No decreases were observed. So Turkey tended to have quite a few rejections for products, including dates. Next slide. And same here, that you can see that the mycotoxins, very high reason for rejecting food. Next slide. Now this is showing that even United States products were rejected from getting into the EU, second only to Turkey, as far as the amount of products that were rejected. Next slide. So the FDA does check foods. I have no idea how much they check it or how often, but there is a program to check mycotoxins in foods. Next slide. So aflatoxin, as I mentioned, is probably one of the worst ones. You really don't want to see that on your mycotox test. If you do, again, most likely coming from food, not a building, although it's possible. So these are known carcinogens. Known carcinogens to susceptible laboratory animals and presumably to humans. So we already know that that's the case. So you want to have, as it says here, the lowest practical level that you can get in your food. Historically, aflatoxin levels in peanuts and corn have been highest in the southeastern states. Of course, that's where they grow most peanuts anyway, but corn from anywhere may be affected, depending on the growth, harvesting, and storage conditions. Next slide. So peanuts, again, largely in the South. Now, these are not really nuts, right? These are under the ground. They put them in big piles. And this is one place where you may not want organic peanuts or peanut butter because they cannot use fungicides on organic stuff. And so guess what? Your choice is either fungicide or mold. I'm not sure which one I'd pick. Peanuts aren't great anyway. They're just not a good fat, period. Patulin, this is again mostly in apples, but interestingly here, again, this is the FDA saying this can occur at high levels in apple juice, including pasteurized. So therefore, both pasteurized and non-pasteurized can be a problem. And guess what kids eat are given a lot of apple juice, right? Juice packs. And again, here's the FDA stating apple juice could pose a health risk if the juice is consumed over an extended period of time. I don't know how long that time is that a week or a year, but generally not the best. And again, organic won't fix that. Next slide. Deoxynivalenol, again, this is the most common every year in grains around the world, including the US. So several grains, wheat, corn, barley, rye, associated with a number of human adverse effects. Again, they call this vomitoxin for a reason. Next slide. Ochratoxin, very common contaminant in cereals, grains, again, all these similar foods we've been talking about. It's been found in edible animal tissues as well. So this is an interesting fact that, you know, well, if this is all in grains, we'll just go grain-free, which probably isn't a bad idea anyway, but it can be in the meat you're eating too. These are not destroyed, these are heat-stable molecules, mycotoxins. So heat won't, you can't cook it out. And so if your animal, if a cow is being fed moldy hay and then you eat the cow, you're still getting the mycotoxins in the meat. And this has been found in human blood, sera, and milk, and breast milk as well. Next slide. Fumonisins, also very common in corn, probably the most common corn contaminant. Again, I generally advise folks not to eat corn anyway. It's a high glycemic veggie, so to speak. And of course, corn is very widely used in the Americas and all over the world, really, but it's a staple in many places, the corn flour. And it says here, recent studies have demonstrated the presence of fumonisins in human foods, including cornmeal and breakfast cereals, has been linked to esophageal cancer. So breakfast cereals, cornmeals, and also down here bottom, interesting note, in descending order of highest to lowest contamination level, bran is the worst, and then flour, flour meal, grits, and flaking grits. So as you get rid of the outer surface, you're going to get rid of more of the mycotoxins. So bran would be the worst. Next slide. So just a graphical presentation of which ones show up and how much. So deoxynivalenol, very common, followed by fumonisins, aflatoxin, again, not as much. Next slide. Encephalomalacia is a direct problem. There's mycotoxic leukoencephalomalacia. It can affect the white matter of the brain. Now, if you folks do MRIs like I do of the brain, you may almost universally see white matter changes, you know, a non-specific consequence. You'll see that over and over again. Many things can do that. You know, MS, clear, classic, you get white matter changes, but Lyme can do that. So can mycotoxins. So in horses, this is a particular problem. It literally turns their brain into mush and they die. So this is almost strictly from contaminated corn. And they basically get ataxia, tremor, depression, and finally death. Now, could lower levels of that cause tremor in humans, you know, maybe essential tremor or make tremor worse? Quite possibly. So maybe worth looking for mycotoxins in those folks. Next slide. And this is just several studies showing the damage, this leukoencephalomalacia in animals. Next slide. Aspergillus fumigatus is probably the most, which produces gliotoxin, which is on the GPL tox test. The most common causative agent of disease in humans. Now, this can be in buildings, it can be in food, but this also can damage the glia, and there's a correlation with brain damage and gliotoxin levels. Again, this, as I mentioned earlier, it's in the presence of bacteria-derived lipopolysaccharide, which we have in our gut, which can be a problem, as we know. This supercharges that damage. So really not a good thing to have together. Next slide. So hopefully this runs. Let's see. This is a video from the company that makes that worldwide mycotoxin survey. And you'd be amazed at what they know about each mycotoxin, what it does to the body, and how to treat it. All naturally, it turns out. They have ways to detoxify mycotoxins, remove them from the system, destroy them actually in the body with enzymes and other supplements. Let's see if this runs.
Most types of grains are infested by molds that produce mycotoxins, which are hazardous to animals and humans. Mycotoxins cost the global livestock and aquaculture industries billions each year. Monitoring and mitigation have therefore become indispensable. Since 2004, the annual Biomin Mycotoxin Survey analyzes thousands of agricultural commodity samples from across the world. Latest results show that over 80% contain one mycotoxin or more. Mycotoxins impair animal productivity and health status, affecting various organs and in extreme cases, resulting in mortality. These toxins vary in terms of effects and chemical structures and require different approaches. The 30-plus year commitment of Biomin to mycotoxin research has produced cutting-edge ways to counteract a broad range of mycotoxins, complemented by advanced detection tools such as Spectrum 380 to measure more than 380 mycotoxins in one go. These toxins vary in terms of effects and chemical structures and require different strategies to combat them. MycoFix is an innovative, all-in-one feed additive using 3 different strategies to deliver absolute protection. It contains 3 components authorized by the EU for proven safety and effectiveness. 1. Adsorption. Clay minerals selectively bind adsorbable mycotoxins such as aflatoxins. MycoFix offers the highest and most specific aflatoxin adsorption with over 95% effectiveness. 2. Biotransformation. The most scientifically advanced way to combat mycotoxins uses a unique combination of patented specific enzymes and biological components to convert mycotoxins into non-toxic, environmentally safe metabolites. This process is irreversible. Fumzyme, a unique purified enzyme, cleaves the 2 side chains from fumonisins, resulting in non-toxic metabolites. Feeding trials have demonstrated the effectiveness of Fumzyme as measured by the SA-SO ratio, a key biomarker. Biomin BBSH cleaves the toxic epoxy group from trichothecenes, transforming them into harmless metabolites. Biomin BBSH has been proven to significantly reduce DON concentration in serum. Due to its structural similarity to estrogen, zearalenone latches onto the estrogen receptor, causing hyperestrogenism. Biomin MTV, a patented yeast strain, breaks zearalenone's lactone ring. In vitro trials confirmed the degradation into a non-estrogenic metabolite. Similarly, Biomin MTV degrades ochratoxin A, rendering it non-toxic. 3. Bioprotection. The Biomin Bioprotection Mix, a scientifically proven blend of carefully selected plant and algae extracts, prevents damage caused by mycotoxins. While mycotoxins inhibit immune cell growth, weakening animals' defenses, the bioprotection mix restores immune cell proliferation, ensuring proper liver and immune system function. Finally, the adsorption and bioprotection strategies combine to provide endotoxin protection of over 93%. MycoFix unites these three strategies to combat mycotoxins using patented proprietary technology, making it the most advanced mycotoxin protection available.
This again is from those people. And this is interesting slide. So you can see each toxin here is listed with its known effects in cows. So now it turns out they have this for all animals. So for T2 toxin, deoxynivalenol, again, same thing here with pigs. Next slide. And chickens. So we can just stay here for a minute. But so zuranolone is known to increase or to hinder fertility. So you can see it has decreased egg production, ovarian cysts, embryo loss. So basically infertility. Could this relate to women who have problems conceiving? Yes, theoretically anyway. So if you have a patient that has continuous problems with conception or of loss, fetal loss, you may want to check their zuranolone level. So again, each organ, each mycotoxin, well known. Next slide. And they even have levels that are clinically significant or not. Now, we don't have this for us yet. Great Plains has been one of the few labs that's actually done tests on humans to see what's average, which sometimes they'll modify their baseline readings, what's quote normal or average. That's still in process basically because there's no one else doing this really. So as far as finding these levels on average. So again, in animals, they know that certain levels have no clinical effect and others are toxic. So for Aspergillus, for instance, you can see at less than 100 parts per billion, no effect. 300 to 2,000, you get poor growth, liver damage, jaundice, immunosuppression. So they're much more dialed in to levels of toxicity. Next slide. And again, there's treatments for all of these things. So you can eliminate the molds, you can protect the gut, you can bind the mycotoxins, you can actually deactivate these mycotoxins in vivo. Next slide. So again, there have been some studies done in humans, almost all of them in Europe. I haven't seen a single one from the US yet. So this is where they studied multiple mycotoxins in adults and children, and they found that there was exposure across the board, multiple. This is in Belgium. So deoxynivalenol, once again, the top urinary marker found. It was detected in children as well. This is the first time it was actually looked for in children. So the biomarker analysis showed a clear exposure of a broad segment of the Belgian population to deoxynivalenol, ochratoxin, and citrinin or citrinin. So for those folks that say there's no mold in urine, well, you'd have to say why this is not correct then, because it's almost universal. And they also came to the conclusion that risk assessment based on urinary levels indicates a potential concern for a number of individuals. So the concern here is because children have a smaller body weight, they may have a higher food intake, per kilogram of body weight. It could be worse for kids. Next slide. So yes, these do include mycotoxin exposure does increase inflammation and cytokine production. Again, if you folks are familiar with the Shoemaker model, that's using blood tests to sort of get a hold of mold exposure effects. Again, none of those are mold tests. The TGF-beta is not, MMP9 is not, none of those are direct mold tests. They can all be raised by other things like stress and smoking. But chronic mold exposures can induce changes in the immune system and increase inflammation. So that is why those markers can be helpful when you're exploring mold exposure in patients. Next slide.
And Dr. Filidei, we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay. So T2 is one of the most toxic. We can just probably slide through some of these here. I think you're getting the idea that this stuff isn't food. So T2, I believe, although I'm not supposed to say, I think, is on the next upcoming test. But these many food-based mycotoxins, I'm really happy that we're going there with Great Plains. This is really going to expand this whole concept of mycotoxins in food. Continue. So aflatoxins worldwide. Turns out this can be in rice, often aflatoxins. So even daily high intake of rice with low levels of contamination can be a health concern. So of course, there's populations that eat lots of rice daily. That may lead to hepatocarcinoma, liver damage. Aflatoxin is really bad for liver. Next slide. You can skip this one. This is on the technology of how to check mycotoxins in the urine. So this, I'm not sure where this is from. This might be from Neil Nathan. I can't remember who I stole this from. But it's listing the way we treat this is take binders, get rid of as many of these orally ingested ones as you can. The water damaged buildings versions also get enterohepatic recirculation, so you want to grab them while they're there. The binders, different binders bind to different things, different mycotoxins. So one, just taking charcoal isn't going to work. That's why I like a broad approach of using clays and charcoals and general detox mechanisms, medications, cholestyramine, not the most fun stuff to use, but that can help. Next slide. So you'd think this was from, IFM, this slide. This is actually from Biomin, the people that make the animal products. So they know about gut health and the microbiome and intestinal permeability and the mucosal immune system. It doesn't sound like a food company. Next slide. And they actually have products to treat this. So this is actually added to animal feed. And look what's in there. Oregano, thyme, garlic, cayenne, cinnamon. They know that this helps detoxify mycotoxins in animals. Now, this is not available for humans. I tried, but you could see where this approach is a good idea, I think. I wish we had more data applicable to us. Next slide. It also can increase lumen, the villus height and depth in the gut. So this is why this is really connected to gut health, leaky gut, etc. That product that you just saw helps increase lumen, the villus height in the lumen, 15% higher, about 15% deeper. So you're increasing surface area in the bowel. So again, oral ingested mycotoxins can absolutely have a connection with leaky gut. And as we know, that can cause pretty much anything else down the road when you have leaky gut. So I think we have one more slide possibly. Yeah, okay. So just to summarize, I'm glad we are now going to have additional mycotoxins from food to look at. The whole point in this lecture really was to show the docs that are doing this test that you need to consider food-based mycotoxins when you're interpreting a urine mycotoxin test. Because you can go on wild goose chases. I used to do that, still do sometimes, as to the actual source of the mycotoxins. It's a little frustrating because patients want to know where it's from and what to do about it. So do I. It's really hard to track this down in food. Near impossible. You could spend lots of money, and I spent some checking foods for mycotoxins. It's really not how shall we say, doable for several reasons. One is it's expensive and you can't really check everything you always eat. Also, even the stuff you do eat, let's say you use some brand every day, some bread product, etc. Even that is going to vary, with each batch. So you don't know, did that batch of wheat do okay in the field? Did that have mycotoxins? They're not testing that. So it's very problematic to check, but just keep it on your radar as far as where it may be coming from. Sorry. I actually sent off several food samples recently for testing. It's not too easy to do. So I was thinking about doing this, and I may, if there's enough interest, I may look into this, getting this available for folks to send in food samples. Right now, it's pretty pricey. Sorry. But I sent off coffee, no mycotoxins. I sent off tea, just from Whole Foods, no mycotoxins. The one thing that did come back was the organic protein I got at Costco that I have every morning, and it had ochratoxin in it. Now, not a whole lot. The bottom line of detection is 1 part per billion. It had 2, so it's probably not a lot. And there's no FDA recommended levels of ochratoxin in food. So, what to do about that? I can't go complain to them because I can't tell them where it should be. But I'm not going to use that brand anymore. So if you or your patient are using something, if you're having trouble figuring out a mycotoxin test, you might want to look into the food aspect, get a little more food diary possibly. Is there something particularly grain-based or nut-based that they're eating all the time? That might be the source. So that's a possibility. Again, food-based, not likely as nearly as bad as living in a water-damaged building. But again, for interpretation of tests, I think you should know this is possible, okay? Sorry about the slides.
That's okay. Thank you, sir. We have time for a few questions here. When you were discussing binders, were you saying that they're only helpful for GI symptoms?
No, not GI symptoms, because the effects can be systemic of mold exposure, but they're not going to be absorbed systemically. So if you take charcoal, it doesn't go into your blood, and clean out your system. It stays in the gut. So it's a lumen only binder, just like almost all binders. I mean, you're not going to take zeolite. It doesn't go into your blood. You wouldn't want zeolite in your blood, or charcoal, or morlanite clay. But this is the same way that the old school cholesterol drugs worked, like cholestyramine, which is used for mold. You take it because it binds to cholesterol in the lumen, and then it takes it out. So it's like a binder and pulls things out. So not just for gut symptoms, no, not at all.
Thank you. Can daily feta cheese consumption cause an elevated mycophenolic acid level of 400?
Particularly feta cheese? Was that the question?
Yes, sir.
Possibly. I did a mycotoxin test early on every day for 5 days. Again, the other big question is when you do one of these tests, many tests, including oat or the mycotoxin, how consistent is that? Does it change the next day? Does it affect just what you ate the night before, right? Because I'm always a pretty critical thinker on tests, as most of my associates know. So I did a test every day for 5 days. And ochratoxin was pretty stable, and I kept a diary, and I had a fairly high mold diet. There was like berries and coffee and whatever. It wasn't a low mold diet, but ochratoxin was pretty consistent every day. I was about 14 to 15, which I think is almost average. The mycophenolic changed a lot every day. It was from 8, then it was 250, then it was 125. So it really bounced around a lot. So that means I was getting it in some product, and it was the same, Monday through Friday. It was same house, same work, nothing changed except the food. So they can vary from day to day. So I wouldn't hang your hat on any of those particular mycotoxins with one test. So it could be feta, possibly. But again, and mycophenolic isn't good stuff either. That's actually an immunosuppressive drug, literally, that they give people mycophenolic acid for immunosuppression for transplant patients. But theoretically, it could be in the cow or the cow milk, and then it gets in there. But it's really tough to track down food-based mycotoxins. Again, the likeliest sources are going to be grains and nuts and seeds that are stored. We talked about doing a low mold diet. What does that mean? Well, it would probably be just like fresh vegetables. if you wanted to do like a clean out, because they're not likely to be moldy in fresh vegetables. Other than that, there could be mold in anything. It could be in food, it could be in grains, it could be fruit as well. Shouldn't have fresh foods shouldn't have a lot of mold.
Thank you, sir. That's all the time we have for questions.
All right.
For those at home, we're going on a 15-minute break, but we wanted to let you know that all qualified attendees will receive a free organic acids test. You must submit the order form to receive your free oat and purchase any additional tests at a special discounted rate. This link will be posted in the chat right now and emailed to you as well. Please submit this form to receive your free oat, and we will see you back after our 15-minute break.